The title of my research project is Violence Against Women, a comparative study of outcomes and conditions for policy reform. The overall purpose of the study is to understand the governance conditions necessary for effective VAL policy reform in ASEAN as seen through a gendered lens. This study uses policy adoption and implementation as the metric for progress, and not the reduction in prevalence, which is hard to compare across countries and over time. The 10 ASEAN member states have committed to VAL policy reform since 2004, thus for 18 years, by ratifying the 2 ASEAN declarations on violence against women. The theoretical and analytical framework is grounded in feminist comparative policy analysis and based on a combination of gender regime theory for macro governance characteristics and feminist institutionalism for macro and meso-level factor analysis, and to examine the effects of formal and informal institutions on policy outcomes. One hypothesis in this study is testing is that VAL policy reform is a function of how the state frames women and gender policy issues, and within that, violence against women. This framing will also inform how the state establishes institutions and agencies in support of women's empowerment and gender equality. The preliminary findings show that there's a big gap between policy adoption and policy implementation. At the regional level, all countries have ratified the declaration. However, adoption of national VAL policy instruments has lagged in several countries. Even where policies have been adopted at country level, implementation is slow, largely due to insufficient human and financial resources. There is uneven progress across countries and across policy actions. The countries with the most progressive VAL policies are Cambodia, Laos PDR, the Philippines, and Vietnam. The responsibility for VAL policy reform tends to fall under the remit of national women's machineries, which are the main government institutions responsible for women and gender-related policy issues. Thus, the success and progress of VAL policy reform is largely a function of the effectiveness of these institutions. The effectiveness of national women's machineries is in turn a function of a number of structural factors. Most visible tends to be the main central agency and their status and location in terms of proximity, access, and relationship to high-level decision makers in government, otherwise known as their political capital. This determines their ability to influence policy making. Standalone central policy agencies are more influential than embedded departments. This structural characteristic determines the national women's machinery's ability to transfer VAL policy advocacy across government. The policy transmission mechanisms are located at the highest political level rather than at the technical mid-level. Thus, representation and political connections matter. Finally, national women's machineries are generally relatively weaker than the rest of government agencies in terms of political influence and status, as well as human and financial resources. Thank you for listening.